Andy McCarthy, former federal prosecutor and Fox News contributor. Nicole Parker joining us now, former FBI special agent with over 12 years of experience. She left the Bureau after she says that it became politically weaponized. And Juan Williams, Fox News senior political analyst. Great to have all of you with us. Nicole, we haven't heard from you this afternoon, so let me start with you. Your reaction to what we've seen so far, and a huge crowd, mostly, it looks to my eye, mostly Trump supporters out there. I saw a couple of lock him up signs, but most of them seem to be waving Trump flags. Your thoughts?
I am from Miami. I was an FBI agent here in the Southern District of Florida. I was at the courthouse yesterday doing some work with Fox, and this is a historical day in the history of the United States. You know, the standard procedures as an FBI agent when we bring someone in is that you're going to first take them to the U.S. Marshals for processing. That's probably what President Trump did. He was moved in then to the courtroom, and under Judge Goodman's jurisdiction, the proceedings took place. The initial appearance, went along with the arraignment. They likely waived the formal reading of the indictment. He had counsel present. He entered a plea of not guilty. And at that moment, he demanded what we call, you demand trial by jury. And he has the right to a speedy trial, which is within 70 days of his initial appearance. And then there is a standing discovery order. And that is within 14 days, he will begin receiving discovery from the federal government and the prosecution to see what they have on him. They likely stipulated to a bond in advance, and President Trump will be on his way back to New Jersey, from what I understand, after these proceedings. It's important for viewers to understand that this initial court proceeding was before Judge Goodman. He is a magistrate judge in the Southern District of Florida, and we know that Judge Cannon has been appointed as the district judge who will hear the proceedings of this trial. And she was randomly selected. Judge Goodman, he is the magistrate judge this week, and that is why the proceedings are taking place in his courtroom today.
Nicole, stay with you for one more question, just because you are so familiar with Miami. We saw the cars pull out of the Doral. We know that Eric Trump, the former president's son, was with him. There was a huge number of Miami police officers who were on motorcycles on the way in. And we're going to hear, I'm sure, some thoughts from the president after he comes out, and certainly tonight when he speaks at the Bedminster Golf Club. But I remember when he was arraigned here in New York City, because now we have some experience with this, he said that people were crying, the people who were processing him. There were some questions about whether or not there was some exaggeration in that, but he said that they were very moved and upset about what they saw. What kind of reaction do you think he's getting at the Miami courthouse, Nicole?
Well, first of all, the process of getting him to the courthouse, I can tell you that you are dealing with the finest. You've got the U.S. Secret Service, you've got Miami-Dade Police Department, and you've got the city of Miami right there in the courthouse. They are putting safety of preeminent importance, and they are the best. I have worked alongside these officers over and over, and they are outstanding. As far as the reaction of those that are, tasked with processing him, I cannot speak to that. As a federal agent, you are a true professional, right? Mm-hmm. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and it is your job to do that. But, from what I understand what you're saying, it might touch people's hearts in a certain way depending on how they feel. But it is so important as an agent that you keep your political opinions outside of your job. And that is very, very important, not just for processing someone, but for conducting all sorts of investigations. Mm-hmm. You cannot allow your personal views to get in the way of you doing your job.
Well, I think that's good advice in a lot of professions, and probably needs to be taken more seriously, including in the media and many parts of American society. Juan, let me bring you in on that note, because we've heard all kinds of reaction to this document, to the charges that are in it. And yet this is the very beginning of the American legal process. This is what he is accused of. We have not heard from his team yet, and we know he's still assembling his team. But what would you say in terms of the caution that's required in waiting until all sides are heard? Because ever since Donald Trump came on the scene, there's been a ton of jumping to conclusions.
I think that's a fair comment, Martha. And I think, one of the things that Jack Smith said in his statement last week was that we all have to presume that Donald Trump is innocent, that his innocence is to be treated as we would treat anybody who was accused of a crime but had not been before a judge, had not been before a jury, had the opportunity to defend himself. And I think that's what, we've been talking about this as a historic moment, the first time a former president is facing federal charges. But I think it's also historic in the sense of reminding all of us that, in this country, we're a nation of laws. Nobody's above the law. And in part of that law is that you have the opportunity to make your case that you are not guilty, that the state does not have power to put you in jail or punish you if you are innocent of the charges in the minds of your peers, and that would be 12 people. Obviously, there were peers on the grand jury who went ahead with the indictment, but ultimately, the grand jury heard from the prosecutors. They did not hear from Donald Trump.
That's right. And it's a very a much lower bar, obviously, for a grand jury to say that they vote in favor of moving forward with the American judicial process, and then both sides will be heard. I'm thinking about what Jack Smith said, Andy McCarthy, about how no one is above the law, right? And one of the problems with where we've been over the past several years is that I think Americans across the country have sort of said, this is what I believe based on what I've learned. And I don't necessarily believe that these entities and agencies that we have all trusted as a country are that trustworthy in all cases anymore. We just, introduced Nicole, who left her job at the FBI because she ran up against a lot of political weaponization. So is Jack Smith right when he says that nobody is above the law?
Well, he's right in principle. I don't know that he's right down here on planet Earth, but it'll be interesting to measure what he said. I think, Martha, he really put a marker down with that, and I would combine that with the way he has laid out in detail the different classified documents that they are attributing to former President Trump. The reason I was so surprised about that is that normally in a national security case, the government would say, it would be too harmful to have this information out in the public domain, and they try to have as much of a clamp on it as they can. In this instance, he put it out there, and he put it out there under circumstances where the very first thing that he told the public in his press conference, as you mentioned, is this idea of one standard of justice. Well, now you have simultaneously a situation where President Biden is also under investigation by a special counsel for mishandling classified information. And I'm just wondering if there's one standard of justice, now that we've gotten an indictment and we've got an itemized list of all these different classified documents that they took from former President Trump, where they gave you the gist of what the document was about, they gave you the classification level, and they put in there what the duration of his illegal possession of them was. Is there any good reason, I can't think of one, why we shouldn't get a similar itemized list to show that there's only one standard of justice? A similar itemized list showing every document. Well, obviously, they're not going to tell us everything that's in it, but the kind of information they gave about Trump, I think they ought to give about Biden. Give us an itemized list. Tell us the classification levels, and tell us how long he possessed them.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Andy. And, when we see in the images in this indictment, walls full of boxes, right? And stacks of boxes in a number of different places. But then there's a section in this indictment which enumerates the classified documents, which, you could fit into half a box. There are 71 of them that are either top secret or secret. That fall into that category. And there are others that are classified. But in terms of the number, and I don't know that the number it's not really the most important thing. The content of what was taken and who saw it and all of that is probably the most important thing. But there are 71 secret or top secret documents, and I don't think that's all that different than what we have learned in some of these other cases, whether it's Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because the hardest thing about this case legally is the political context that it comes up in. And inevitably, especially with President Trump talking about this every single day, which he will be from here on out, you're going to be hearing a lot about the details of the Hillary Clinton case that was not prosecuted and the details of what we know so far with respect to President Biden's possession of these documents. And this is all happening. It's not just one case. It's 4 different cases that are happening in this political context. I was thinking, as Nicole was giving the checklist of things that are happening today and will be happening going forward, in my mind, I'm trying to do the math to multiply this by 3 or 4, depending on how many other cases there are. And, you know, Martha, you and Juan and Mark follow this part of it a lot more closely than I do. But I'm just wondering, given the way this is going to play out, where something is going to be happening every week with respect to these prosecutions involving President Trump, how do the people who are running against Trump get traction for their campaigns?
Yeah,
because it seems to me every week they're going to be asked about this.
Yep, and it's a really sticky wicket. It's a tough thing for them to figure out which way they should go if they're the person who is hoping to knock him out of first place. Let's bring in Marc Thiessen, American Enterprise Institute senior fellow and Fox News contributor. Mark, we've seen a little bit of this, right? We saw Nikki Haley was on this program yesterday, and after coming out initially and saying that prosecutorial overreach was something that really bothers Americans, she cited it as reckless behavior on the part of the president. And she also talked about the fact that she is a military spouse. She said, my husband is about to redeploy, and these secrets are not to be messed with. So how do these individuals navigate this political minefield?
Well, they're struggling with the same thing that most Americans are struggling with, which is that 2 things can be true at the same time. They can be true that Donald Trump's handling of classified information was egregious, outrageous, and possibly criminal, and that he's the victim of selective prosecution by a politicized Justice Department that's been out to get him since day one. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time. And so, you know, these are things that we're navigating and the presidential candidates are navigating. But there's an interesting point also that we need to consider as this plays out politically, which is, you know, and Andy McCarthy, my friend, has laid out very clearly why this is a very, very damning indictment. Jonathan Turley said, you know, he's got to run the table and beat all 37 counts, or he's going to have a terminal sentence and end his life in jail. He also only has to convince 1 juror that he's not guilty, and he's acquitted. Imagine what would happen if Donald Trump was acquitted of this, especially the trial probably happens right before the conventions. If you look back at how his poll numbers went up with the American people after the Mueller probe, when Mueller came out and basically cleared him of Russia collusion, then they had the first impeachment, and before COVID, everybody thought he was a shoo-in for re-election. Can you imagine the bump that he would get, not just with Republicans, but with the public in general, if he were acquitted of these charges, if he were found not guilty? It would mean that the Biden Justice Department probably elected Donald Trump to his 2nd term as president.
Yeah, and then, you know, you have the Durham report, which said that the FBI went off and running on Crossfire Hurricane on a case that was unsubstantiated based on the evidence that they had. And that not only that, then they started to go after FISA approval to spy on members of the Trump campaign and, you know, continue to pursue it, even though they didn't have the foundation to open an investigation, which I think is pretty stunning. You know, we've heard similar things on the opposite side of that equation, and then the investigation just dies, just goes away.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.